spells beyond those at start. Naturally, Magic user player characters will do their utmost to acquire books of spells and scrolls in order to complete their own spell books. To those acquired, the Magic user will add one and only one spell when he or she actually gains an experience level QV. Therefore, most will be frantically attempting to purchase or cozen spells from non-player character Magic users or even from other player character Magic users. How you handle NPC Magic users is of utmost importance. There is a special section of the rules regarding non-player characters, and you should follow the suggestions therein carefully. By doing so, players will find that their Magic user characters are unable to acquire new spells, at worst, or must pay so dearly for them in money, magic items, and quests that the game is hardly worth the candle. Of course, they will pay the price nonetheless, and that will help you maintain the campaign as fresh and challenging, as it will rid of excess treasure and give the player characters reason to adventure at the same time. Superior players will certainly cooperate. Thus, spells will in all probability be exchanged between PC Magic users to some extent. No special sanctions need be taken to prevent such exchange, although this cooperation should never be suggested or otherwise encouraged either. The DM should leave this interaction strictly alone. This is not the case when PCs deal with NPC henchmen or hirelings. Non-player character hirelings or henchmen will absolutely refuse to cooperate freely with player characters, even their own masters or mistresses. Again, this matter is dealt with separately under the section pertaining to the DM's role in operating henchmen and hirelings. As a general rule, they will require value plus a bonus when dealing with their liege. If they deal with other PCs or NPCs at all, they will require double value plus a considerable bonus. For example, Thigru Thorkison, magician in the hire of Olaf Bluecheeks, a 10th level lord, knows the spell Suggestion, and Olaf's associate, Halfden, the necromancer, requests that he be allowed to copy this spell into his book of 3rd level spells. If Olaf is willing, Halfden can approach Thigru. If Halfden has been at least civil to the magician, Thigru will ask nothing more than a 3rd level spell in return, plus another spell, plus some minor magic item, such as a set of 3 potions, a scroll of 3 spells, or perhaps a ring of invisibility. If Halfdan had formally insulted the magician, then the price would be more dear. But supposing the necromancer had actually saved Thigru's life at one time, the cost would be reduced to but a spell exchange and a single potion or scroll of 1 spell. Naturally, the personality of the henchman or hireling would modify the bargain to some extent. A very avaricious or greedy NPC would ask for more magic items and or gold too. As a good DM, you will have developed the character of each henchman and hireling to the extent that such determinations will be relatively easy. Finally, the ramifications of spell scarcity are bound to aid your campaign, and not only with regard to excess treasure and magic items. A scroll of but a single spell becomes highly meaningful to the magic users in the game, especially when it is a spell heretofore unknown. The acquisition of a book of spells from someplace in the dungeon or wilderness of the campaign is a benison beyond price. PC and NPC alike will take great pains to guard scrolls and spellbooks. Magic users will haunt dusty libraries and peruse musty tomes in the hopes of gleaming but a single incantation to add to their store of magic. That was the end of page 39 from the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide by Gary Gygax. I am historian, teacher, pedant, and man about town, Ben Riggs, and with me as always is the Wizard of Wauwatosa, the weapon of mass instruction, Dr. Scott Bruner.
Good morning, everyone. It's excellent to be here.
So, where to begin with this part of the Dungeon Master's Guide? Um, I would say again the economy that Gygax portrays in first edition AD&D is so weird. Um, I have to start with the way that he empowers everyone except the player characters. And he seems to think that everything the player characters do should be onerous and difficult and a pain in the butt and irrespective even of rank and class, especially if you're imitating a society of monarchy. Are you familiar with the story of the Library of Alexandria and the boats in harbor?
I am not.
So, back in the day when the Greeks ruled Alexandria and the pharaoh was a Greek, a standing order went out to search any boat that came into the port of Alexandria. And they would take any books discovered on the boats to the Library of Alexandria, where the books would then be copied by the scribes. The copies of the books would then be returned to the boats, and the originals kept at the Library of Alexandria. And you'll notice nobody was standing around being like, I demand gold pieces. Like, I demand money. I'm going to stop the Pharaoh from the God King from doing this. No, there was none of that. Like, so the idea that in a monarchy, like, because again, the example he used there specifically was a lord wants a spell of a hireling, right?
It was, and I wonder if that. So I'm with you. I wonder if the 10th level Lord is not necessarily a like a royalty title, but actually one of the titles that players receive because of becoming 10th level. Like Lord may be one of those.
Like
Uh,
like a 10th level's ranger is a lord or something.
yeah, one of the coolest things that we that some of the kind of side tabletop role-playing games have brought back into it. I feel like Shadow Dark is one of those. I think it has actual titles for your characters. But yeah, back in the day, if you were a first level thief, you were a cut purse, but by the 10th level, you were an assassin or something like that. But I think that I'm not entirely positive that the term Lord here in this place means somebody that owned land as much as it means a high-level character of the particular class.
And
That's
again,
my only thought there.
yeah, obviously this is Gygax putting gameplay first because he just wants everything to be hard for the player characters, and I am taking a simulationist counter stance and saying
Yep.
this blows my suspension of disbelief. The idea that you know, anyone and again the fact that it seems like the player characters never uh never get to make a favored role in the game design of Gygax. It seems like it's always uh well, you're going to be fighting uphill and you're going to have to eat dirt and it's going to be terrible for you and you're going to fight and claw and do all this to get just one step ahead. And I remember in the introduction of the DMG he says that sadistic and cruel dungeon masters are always the best. And I'm like, I can see his point there, but this seems to be carrying it to an extreme. Um, when it's this hard to get to do the bare thing that your character class can do, and in addition to that, I don't know what I was going to say.
Yeah, well, I'm with you, and I do think that we go through there's these very many different voices that Gygax uses throughout the DMG, and here we're coming into one of those voices that sounds very much similar to. I'm assuming probably everybody that listens to our podcast probably knows the genesis of one of the most famous modules of all time, the Tomb of Horrors, which was Gary Gygax had. I mean, some of this is apocryphal, but I think most of it is probably true. Was the concept that Tomb of Horrors was written because he was kind of tired of going to conventions and everyone talking about how they had a super heroic character that could absolutely positively not be stopped. I've created a character that is so powerful that no dungeon master can slow down. Just trying to come up with some
Olaf the
ridiculous name.
Uncertain.
Olaf the Uncertain, right? Or what's the oh man, what is one of the best names is in the Slave Lords. I'm totally digressing, but it's like someone the Eye Biter, Worf the Eye Biter, I think is in the Slave Lords modules. Some of these old names. So we just pause for a second to just appreciate how cool some of the names are. I love Olaf Blue Cheeks and I love Thigri Thorkison. But my point was that Tomb of Horrors was, designed specifically as a dungeon that's extremely unfair, because he wanted to be able to say, I don't care how powerful your character is, they need to be kind of brought down to some level. And there's sometimes I think Gygax's voice goes into that concept. This is the dungeon master as opponent, something that we are told now over and over by modern tabletop role-playing systems we're not supposed to be, which I think is true. I just mentioned Shadow Dark a few minutes ago, created by Kelsey Dion, and one of the things there's actually a couple pages in there. Shadow Dark is a fairly efficient and effective role-playing game. At the same time, there's a page there that talks about DMing, kind of the role of the DMing, and it's done in that kind of terse, interesting prose that Shadow Dark is kind of famous for. But again, I think it says there that you should be a fan of the players. That doesn't necessarily mean that's by the way how I DM. I'm always a fan of the players. That doesn't necessarily mean I want them to succeed. I think maybe I'm more a fan of a compelling narrative or compelling experiences than I'm necessarily around what happens to characters' PCs, which often from time to time puts me at odds with the PC. But I digress. I think you're right. I think this is another one of those moments where we're hearing kind of a grumpy, Gygax say, look, you have to make magic items important. You have to make them precious. And I do think the one thing that I would say is also interesting is that I, I've had players in my campaigns who know much more about economics. That's not my jam at all, right? I can't balance a checkbook. Not that we do that anymore. But there is a high, I feel like even in the except for Tomb of Horrors, which would be an exception, but I ran Slave Lords a couple years ago, and it's interesting. Like Gygax is pretty generous with the amount of loot and magic items that you can get in some of those old games, and I feel like a lot of the downtime rules are somehow trying to push back to not let characters get too powerful, to not let the game run away with everyone having access to Fireball constantly. So, and again, the way that I am as a DM, I read this, and I'm like, yeah, exactly, exactly. Magic should be rare. The thing is, like, it does, it's very different than how it's going to be in second edition because this is this concept, him telling you about hirelings and how they're all going to work and giving you a specific example is very non-modular. It's very specific to this type of world that the DMG is has to create, right? Or what is expected of D&D is this world where magic is rare. We don't share knowledge. It's something that folks hang on to. It's an Ayn Randian world, less than a democratic world, right? We're not, as you mentioned, the Alexandria story, where this is not about a free and open exchange of communication of ideas. No, magic must be guarded in your tower and protected by a Yuan-Ti. I also think
I,
that we
I, I do want to point out with the Alexandria story,
Mhm.
it does take a dominator hierarchy, this sort of authoritarian figure to come and just declare knowledge is free, and it's more like seizing it in many ways, than freely exchanging it. But
Yeah, yeah.
that said, like the idea that Gygax is going to say, no matter what the situation, even if you are above the possessor of the knowledge on the social hierarchy, that you will make onerous demands of your social betters in a much more rigidly hierarchical society than the one that we live in. That just takes me out of it. I'm like, dude, you just seem to be, again, making the players eat dirt. Sorry, I interrupted your thought.
No, 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 that was fine. It was fine. There's two things that I want to say. Well, one is I think we're bearing the lead, which is I like the last sentence where they're like, and if the character has saved the other character's life, maybe he'll just do it for a spell scroll. Like that's kind of ridiculous. Like I saved your life. Can I please have access to suggestion? Can I just get continual light? I'm not asking for much. I literally saved your life. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention, which is a little bit more um, on the surface, is that we haven't talked about the use of the word. Uh, where was it? Oh,
Benison?
no. That one, cozen, and I had never heard the phrase something like "this is not worth a candle."
Well, not where the candle is, um, a great expression.
Yeah, to,
And again, I couldn't tell you the last time I heard it. I'm going to make a guess here, and then I'm going to look it up on Google. But I'm assuming it means that back in the day, to read at night, you had to burn the candle, and to read things. And if you're reading something and you don't
oh,
like it, you're like, oh, it's not worth the candle. But I'm going to Google that right now. But that is my assumption at that reference. Benison means blessing. Thank you, Shakespeare. So again, we're getting some of that gigastic bombast here. Gygax Gygaxian bombast. Gygaxian bombast. Um, not worth the candle. Not worth the candle. Definition and meaning. Origin story is not worth the candle. The game is not worth the candle. Let's go with Merriam-Webster. Meaning it is not worth the necessary cost or trouble. The car is so old that replacing the engine is not worth the candle, which is a very weird example sentence. Um, and they don't have an origin in Merriam-Webster for that. So we're right about the meaning, but let me go back and type origin into Google. The expression began as a translation of a term used by French essayist Michel de Montaigne in 1580, alludes to gambling by candlelight, which involved the expense of illumination. If the winnings were not sufficient, they did not warrant the expense. Used figuratively, it was a proverb within a century. The game is not worth a candle, is the initial use of it by Montaigne. Well, that's interesting. We all learned
okay,
something today.
we did. And cozen means to trick or deceive.
Huh,
So
nice.
getting the spell, you can not only purchase it, nor can you trick or deceive your way into getting the spells, which is interesting. What was the other one? The last one.
Benison means blessing. I don't remember.
Perfect.
Um, And since you invoked the name of Kelsey Dion, I will say I think she posted this publicly on social media that Kelsey is looking for her original 3.0 Player's Handbook Dungeon Master's Guide and Monster Manual. Um, and that she apparently sold them off about 15 years ago and would really like to have those specific copies back. And so if you purchased a used 3.0 Player's Handbook, DMG, or Monster Manual, you should go and look on the inside cover. And if says Kelsey Dion on the inside cover, she would love to talk to you about reacquiring her original PHB, DMG, and Monster Manual.
Perhaps you'd
Um,
be willing to part with 3 potions, a scroll of 3 spells, or perhaps a ring of invisibility to get that book back.
She also mentioned that they're probably in the Wisconsin area, which I was like, oh, that's a thing I didn't know about Kelsey Dion. So I don't know where she is now, but apparently 15 years ago she was around here. So
Why does she
given
want it back? What's the reason? Is there
it sounded
is
like
this?
sentimentality. I just went and glanced on Facebook and I'm not friends with her. I think this was on a public I think she publicly posted this in
Mhm.
like in like a subgroup somewhere. But I couldn't go and find the original post. But I figure since we have a mouthpiece here and you and I are based in the Wisconsin area, that we would shout about it online. All right, should I turn the page to page 40 and see what horrors await us next?
Yeah, and it's funny because I was kind of flipping ahead a few minutes ago. I don't want to get too I don't want to get ahead at all, but I am going to mention it was interesting to me. I didn't remember this is on the next page, and I guess we're not going to get there today. But at some point, it's interesting. There's runes on the next page, and then on the next page, there's like pictures of pentagrams and magic rune circles. And I'm like, ooh, look at this! They, bothered about Dungeons and Dragons must have gone crazy when they started seeing how to draw runes in your home basement. All right, yes, let's keep.
Okay. Recovery of spells, page 40 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. Spell recovery, whether cleric druid or magic user illusionist, requires about the same period of time. In order to pray and meditate for a new spell to replace one used, or in order to study and memorize such a spell, it is necessary that the spell user rest and revitalize his or her mental faculties. Whether one or more spells are to be regained, the minimum time required for complete rest, usually sleep, is that required for the highest spell to be recovered. Minimum rest periods are shown below. So if you have a spell of level 1 to 2, it will take 4 hours of rest to recover that spell. If you have a spell of levels 3 to 4, it will take 6 hours of rest to recover that spell. If you have a spell of 5 to 6th level, you will take 8 hours to recover that spell. If you have a spell of level 7 to 8, it takes 10 hours to recover that spell. If you have a spell of ninth level, it takes 12 hours to recover that spell. Thus, if a cleric or magic user needs only memorize first or second level spells, he or she need only sleep for 4 hours and then will be able to memorize or regain as many such spells as he or she is normally entitled to. On the other hand, if the character in question also wished to include a seventh level spell, rest time would be 10 full hours, even though but a single seventh level spell were to be thus regained, while half a dozen second level spells were also to be regained. Once rested, an additional 1/4 hour per level of spell must be spent in study/prayer and meditation in order to memorize/acquire the ability to cast each spell. Fancy and magic is weird. Um, it seems to kind of work for D&D, but it just doesn't like it doesn't feel the way that I don't know, memorization and forgetting and praying to gods. Like, again, it's just so clearly designed to be an expendable resource. Um, when it feels to me that the most natural thing would be for a spell to be more like a superpower, where you kind of have access to it all the time. But of course,
Yeah.
that really unbalances things, right?
Yeah, well, it's interesting to me. We had this discussion, I think, a couple weeks ago when we were talking about these things, and I'm going to continue to defend Vancian Magic because it's probably my favorite Magic system, with the caveat that I do like the systems that, man, this is, I swear, we are not. We're not sponsored today by Shadow Dark, but it's coming up again. Both the Shadow Dark and the Dungeon Crawl Classic systems, where you do have this spell for as long until you roll poorly and then you lose it, I actually like quite a bit as well. But it's interesting I mean, we could go off in a big digression, which is one of the biggest complaints that people have about modern Dungeons and Dragons, is that the characters are superheroes, right? And it's one of the things that I do not like about a lot of the modern tabletop role-playing game systems. I mean, I'm way more on Gary Gygax's side throughout this prose. I approach Dungeons and Dragons in many ways like an old school adventure game, that success is not guaranteed, that there are many grisly ways to die. I'm looking at you, King's Quest. And I like the Vancian magic system because I don't want my characters to be superheroes, because isn't supposed to be a superhero game. I don't like the concept of like Cyclops walking around, being able to press a button at any time and shoot off a blast of force. You know, when I play 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, it drives me crazy where all the Warlock ever does. And you've probably heard me say this because the Warlock is such a cool class concept, and why they are nothing but this kind of canon of Eldritch Blast always kind of drives me nuts. I think this ties into the previous page, which is that magic has to be important. It has to be something that when you are going to cast a spell, you have to be ready to know that that's going to take some type of sacrifice, whether it's going to be time, which is at a premium in early Dungeons and Dragons, or like Dungeon Crawl Classics. It's interesting, of course, it's different in Dungeon Crawl Classics. The attrition is not only do you have to worry about losing the spell or time, but the more magic you cast in Dungeon Crawl Classics, the more it's actually corrupting your character, which is fantastic as well. And I think that that's embedded in some of the aesthetic of the game, which is that magic is a really powerful concept. It shouldn't be able to be cast I loathe cantrips. Everybody's ever played in my games, that's like my biggest thing. They just saying the word cantrip to me sets me off. This concept that you could like, and I like the concept of, oh my gosh, I'm digressing. I love the concept of a cantrip, which is that every wizard is also like a part-time magician, could make a quarter disappear out of someone's ear at any time. That's fine. But Eldritch Blast to me is not a cantrip. That's a superpower. That is you becoming Cyclops. That is you walking around and being able to shoot blasts of force out of your hands. And that to me changes the game from a strange, uncanny, medieval fantasy game that bears very little in common to, even if we say that folks like Fafhrd, Grey Mouse, or Conan are superheroes in some way, that they have powers and abilities. They're generally, especially Fafhrd and Grey Mouse, are always constantly dealing with the world being very much more powerful than them. In many ways, they're almost, I don't want to use the term trickster because that's loaded, but in many ways, they game the system. If there's anybody that's combat as war more than combat at sports, Fafhrd and Grey Mouse are trying to take any type of strange advantage they have because the world is so powerful, because magic is so dangerous. So to me, I don't like high magic games. I want it to come at a significant cost, and I like the concept of attrition of D&D. That being said, like I said, I do kind of like I find the one thing is I do like the Shadow Dark and DCC systems where you're like, okay, you can cast it for a few times, but you've got to roll every time, and you're going to lose it if you get a roll. That I think is a nice compromise to kind of the modern
Well, and
player sensibilities.
I am complaining about this uh as theory, right? And again, this moment I think is actually a really interesting pivot point for us because I am complaining about the concept and theory of magic in first edition AD&D. And yet when we talk about my best D&D experiences, it's playing old school essentials, it's playing like first level 5th edition. Um and in those situations where it's like, oh crap, one hit and I might be dead.
Yeah.
The tension at the table just ratchets up. And it totally disappears when you have characters with high hit points and a lot of power and a lot of durability. Um, so even though I am sitting here complaining about the way I think I've complained about everything so far today. Um, and I'm pretty sure in previous episodes I've complained about Vancian magic. And yet
Mhm.
at the table, it you are correct that it produces an amazing experience for players
Yeah.
because of peril, threat, and scarcity. Um, and again, maybe like maybe Gygax, you could cut him a break just on getting new spells. Like you don't need to have a ton of new spells, but just make it a little easier to get those new spells. Maybe we cut him a break there. But so for all my complaining, I am only complaining about the theory. When I've used this at the table, it does seem to work, and I do prefer the DCC and Shadow Dark systems that you described. All right,
Yeah.
should I keep going?
No, because I have
Okay,
so much more to say on
okay,
that. And I
say
think
more.
this, first of all, about this paragraph, I think it's absolute nonsense. It's absurd. It's ridiculous. It's not easy to use. This Gygax thing of like, all right, who is going to, when their wizard is ready to sleep and regain his spells, is going to be like, all right, I've got this. And I know that the language at the end is trying to make it simpler, even though it makes it more difficult. It's like, well, you don't actually have to sleep this whole time for all these spells, but nobody in the actual table I think, and you know what, I always throw this out there. I was like, did anybody actually use these rules as written? Because this is one of those rules that I don't even ever remember reading. But that wasn't my point. I wanted to talk about something that I think you're bringing up, which is an interesting thing, because you instantly, I have, like I said, I have a few things a few pet peeves about Dungeons and Dragons. So not pet peeves about Dungeons and Dragons, but kind of approaches to Dungeons and Dragons. One of those things is like the mana, the cantrip, which I'm not a big fan of. But one of the other things, and you hear it a lot. And I'm not saying it's entirely not without some merit, but one of the things that is always driving me crazy is like people talked about, the first level magic user in early editions of Dungeons and Dragons, once they've cast their magic missile, they have nothing to do. And that always drives me nuts when people say that. I'm not saying it's not entirely without merit, but it does mean, and this is my pet peeve. It means looking at the game through just simply the game mechanics, right? And this concept that my character, it's a monopoly system. Like, okay, I have a character and it's completely like this is to me to say something like that is to completely miss what's revelatory about tabletop role-playing games, which is no, you can do anything that you want. You have a spell, that's a cool thing you can do, but your character should not be defined by the numbers on the sheet. There's so many folks that look, and we've had a couple designers on the show and we've talked a little bit, we've kind of danced on this concept, but what do rule mechanics do as far as making a person look at the lens of the world or the game through the characteristics and the agency of their characters through mechanics, which I just don't do. So when I created magic users when I was playing first edition D&D, sure, I mean, I remember it. All right, if folks remember the old gold box games like Pool of Radiance, Curse of the Azure Bonds, all those games, your magic user doesn't have much to do after they've cast magic missile, except throw darts, which is always kind of funny. I like the little animation, Pool of Radiance, casting darts, but I digress. The the point is in a tabletop role-playing game where you're sitting around with five other folks, your wizard has cast their magic missile for the day. They're still a character. They're still an embodied subjectivity in this world that can do lots of things, right? I don't understand the concept of thinking about your character as just the use of, and this it comes back to that super heroic view of tabletop role-playing games. My character is just my powers, right? I'm Wolverine. I can quickly, I don't know, I'm picking on the X-Men today. I could do this, but once I'm done, there's nothing left for me to do. I have to like go back and just sit and watch what's going on. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that in combat you you're as powerful as the warrior, right? That's one of the cool things about being a warrior in first edition D&D is like I'm going to continue to be able to be kind of a stark fighting machine. But if we think about combat as war, if we think about the early editions of D&D, there's still things that your character can do. What can you do to help the warrior? What can you do to take advantage of the environment? What would Merlin do in this instance? Is there some way that you could gain an advantage by using your knowledge of the arcane world and the spirits out there? I It always drives me crazy to think of characters in terms of what the mechanics allow you to do rather than thinking through the fiction of what would your character, who is this, even if it's an aspiring hedge wizard, what would they do in this instance? Right? How can they help someone? Okay, maybe you can't take the troll on toe to toe, but what could you do to help the person who is going toe to toe? I know I'm going off on a little bit of a rant here, but I think that I always think it's interesting to think about folks who look at the game mechanics and like, well, that's how the world is, rather than I suppose folks like us, coming more from a literary perspective, who really more want to become immersed in what does the scene actually look like and what would my character do in the situation, regardless of what the rules say my character is able to do, regardless of what powers I've been given.
Right. I'm gonna press on because we have reached spell casting. Holy cow. I can't believe it. It only took 4 years. Spell casting. All magic and cleric spells are similar in that the word sounds, when combined into whatever patterns are applicable, are charged with energy from the positive or negative material plane. When uttered, these sounds cause the release of this energy, which in turn triggers a set reaction. The release of the energy contained in these words is what causes the spell to be forgotten or the writing to disappear from the surface upon which it was written. Let's pause for a moment here, if you don't mind. So, this is obviously more like physics or maybe even metaphysics to explain the mechanics of spellcasting, which again, I suppose I'm sitting here and thinking Harry Potter never explained how like the metaphysics of their magic.
Yeah.
Tolkien never does. It
And
just ha
modern editions to tabletop, modern editions to Dungeons and Dragons don't. I'm sorry, I don't remember reading this as a kid, and I'm like, this is so cool. I like that we're like getting into the
yeah.
how this works. Of course, again, bother about Dungeons and Dragons is like, no, see, they're telling you how to do it. That's how they talked.
And like, Brandon Sanderson is probably the most notable magic system creator of the 21st century. And again, his Mistborn books I know pretty well. And it's all metal based magic. Like you swallow metal and you like burn. You're born special and you can burn the metal to produce superhuman effects essentially. Um, and it's a really cool system, but he never really explains like, so this is how the magic makes the metal burn. You just accept it. You're like, okay, it's metal based. You burn metals in your stomach, and that's what happens, and you get magic powers. But I suppose Gygax here, he never says how or why you're able to access these vast pools of extra planar power. We just accept, oh, well, certain goofy hand gestures tap into infinite power beyond reality. But yeah, this is really interesting. Should I keep going or
Yeah.
you want to say
Well,
anything?
I just want to say, I want to make a really good cliffhanger for folks to come to our next episode because I don't think we'll probably get to it. But excuse me, but at the end of the spellcasting session, he's going to mention a bunch of actual Appendix N text on where he got this spellcasting system. Sorry, I was reading quickly ahead. Well, I saw these giant bolded words, and I'm like, oh, look at those books. So, for those readers out there, if we don't get it to it today, make sure you listen to the next episode because this spellcasting section is just I'm just completely and I oh my gosh, let's just keep reading. This is
All right,
so
let's do
cool.
it. Good. Yeah, this is the good stuff. The triggering action draws power from some plane of the multiverse. Whether the spell is abjuration, conjuration, alteration, enchantment, or whatever, there is a flow of energy, first from the spellcaster, then from some plane to the area magicked or enspelled by the caster. The energy flow is not from the caster per se, it is from the utterance of the sounds, each of which is charged with energy which is loosed when the proper formula and or ritual is completed with their utterance. This power then taps the desired plane, whether or not the spell user has any idea of what or where it is, to cause the spell to function. It is much like plugging in a heater. The
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
very relevant when it's a cold Wisconsin winter.
Yeah.
Uh, the electrical outlet does not hold all of the electrical energy to cause the heater to function, but the wires leading from it ultimately to the power station bring the electricity to the desired location. Many spells also require somatic motions in conjunction with words. The spoken words trigger the release of the magical energy, and the hand movements are usually required in order to control and specify the direction, target area, etc. of the spell effects. When the spell energy is released, it usually flows to the prime material from the positive or negative material plane. To replace it, something must flow back in reverse. The dissolution and destruction of material components provides the energy that balances out this flow through the principle of similarity. Sometimes this destruction is very slow, as is the case with Druid's Mistletoe. Those spells without apparent material components are actually utilizing the air exhaled by the magic user in the utterance of the spell. Release of word sound energy, release of word sound stored energy is not particularly debilitating to the spellcaster, as he or she has gathered this energy over a course of time prior to the loosing of the power. It comes from outside the spellcaster, not from his or her own vital essence.
Huh.
The power to activate even a first level spell would leave a spellcaster weak and shaking if it were drawn from his or her personal energy, and a third level spell would most certainly totally drain the caster's body of life. Because spells tap power from other planes, any improper casting is likely to cause the spell not to function. The heater is turned on, but you haven't plugged it in, or you've plugged it in, but not yet turned it on. Or to malfunction. You held onto the prongs of the plug when you tapped the current, or you accidentally dropped the heater as you were plugging it in, or perhaps you plugged in some other appliance or device by mistake. Such happenings are covered in the various chances for spell malfunction. If your players inquire as to how spells work, or fail to do so, you can explain without difficulty the precepts of the AD&D Magic spell system. For background reading, you can direct campaign participants to Vance's The Eyes of the Overworld and the Dying Earth, as well as to Belair's The Face in the Frost. Okay, wow. You want to go first, or should I?
The first thing I want to bring up is, first of all, this is just so fantastic. I love this section so much. I don't remember reading it as a kid. I could read this over and over again. The prose just, I mean, the strange, extremely weirdly pragmatic metaphor of the heater is funny and weird and almost breaks up what I just thought was beautiful floweriness, but I love the metaphor. But I do want to make sure that we pause for a second. That in between, but at the after the penultimate paragraph to the second paragraph, there is a Earl Otis illustration. Earl Otis being my favorite artist from the old school manuals, and it's an interesting image of a what looks like a skeleton with a hood on. The skeleton obviously must be some type of spellcaster. Perhaps it's a lich, perhaps it's, I don't know, skeleton lord. And it seems to be casting a spell at the same time that a human wizard is casting a spell, although I can't see much about the spells because of this. There's a skeleton and a wizard. They're both pointing fingers at each other, directing this magical spell energies as if the heater had been plugged in. And the spell from the wizard is hitting the skeleton in the chest, and the spell being cast from the skeleton is hitting the wizard directly in the face. It's a fun little, strange little image that I think evokes kind of what we're talking about here. There's so much to unpack in this. I don't know where to begin, but I'm going to say one quick thing. This is the first time Gygax has abjuration, conjuration, alteration, enchantment magic. He's actually breaking them down into significant spell schools. I had always been under the, well, my memory always starts like it was really second edition who ran with this, but here is him breaking up the different schools of magic early in first edition. I don't know where else we can go. There's so much to talk
I mean,
about here.
I'm gonna briefly start in with
Hmm.
Sir James Fraser and the Golden Bough. Um, if you are unfamiliar with James Fraser's Golden Bough, it is a lengthy and magisterial work of early anthropology that is largely considered wrong now, but is incredibly beautifully written. And it's like he was the Joseph Campbell of his day. People read it and were like, "Oh, all these beautiful and amazing stories." And it was originally designed to explain the ritual of human sacrifice at a pagan temple called, I believe, Nemi in southern Italy. And of course, now everyone's like, well, this doesn't really work, but it's very beautiful and it's a good collection of stories. Kind of like Joseph Campbell today. If you read Joseph Campbell too deeply, you're like, oh, there's a lot of things I don't like here, and this is really troubling. Um, but at the time when I was reading it, I was like, oh, great, what a fun collection of stories. I read his Egypt section and I'm like, oh, this is great. I'm so excited to move to Egypt. And then after living in Egypt, I look at it and I'm like, this is shallow and barely scratches the surface of many things and has a lot of mistakes. But anyway, um, the principle of magic is incredibly important in the Golden Bough. It is in many ways a research on the practice of ancient magic in on the planet Earth. And Fraser describes the magic that he is talking about as sympathetic magic. And learnreligions.com talks about it this way. The idea behind sympathetic magic is, at its core, that a person can be affected magically by actions performed towards something that represents them. Sir James Fraser, who wrote The Golden Bough, summarized the concept of sympathetic magic as, quote, like produces like. It's the voodoo doll. You have a voodoo doll of a person, and you stab a person with the voodoo doll, and that person is like, ow, my stomach, I've been hurt by the voodoo doll. That is sympathetic magic. And the reason that I'm digressing about this is because sympathetic magic crosses cultures all over Earth. It is one of the foundational, magic systems of real world occultism, and it is nowhere in Dungeons and Dragons. Is again, maybe Vance uses this. I don't know, but like this is nothing like real world occultism historically. This is a totally new thing. The idea that there's just this well of power outside reality. And again, there's tons of, hey, I'm a witch and I have a demon familiar. I have a demon slave that does things for me in exchange for my soul. And the demon is the source of the power because the demon has powers. Like, but the idea that again, there's this just well of energy that you can tap infinitely. It's a to me, I start thinking about it, the electricity analogy says a lot.
Yeah.
Like
Hmm.
I don't think pre-modern humanity would have accepted the idea that there's power that you can almost infinite power you can just touch and use by like plugging a cord into the wall. I think people in the past would have been like, that's nonsense. It seems just fundamentally untrue to our experience of reality. But I have now it's your turn to go on, Scott. I have done my link, and again, I don't know if we can credit Gygax with the origin of this idea, but it is unique to me.
Well, I think I don't know if the concept of of outside powers having infinite power or the fact that we are on a I mean it completely contextualizes this concept of us being on the prime material plane in between these larger battles between much more significant forces beyond us. Again, I'm not a historian, sociologist, or anthropologist, but to me that seems like it resonates with a way that certainly a lot of religions kind of view the world. And in many ways, we are, I don't know, we use the term the battleground, but we're definitely the testing or experimental ground for these concepts of powers being, beyond us that are actually in. The more I talk about it, the more I'm thinking in terms of, I can't get away from thinking about Descent into Inverness, perhaps my least favorite fifth edition adventure, but the concept that there's the blood war, which is, part of the fiction, the concept that demons and devils are in this big battle and it has ramifications on the prime material plane is like a testing ground for human souls. I feel like that's an old kind of religious concept. And in this, when we think about it as energies, what we're doing is to use the heating metaphor, where technically the wizard is plugging it into like these different areas. Like, where am I going to get power from these worlds that are beyond my ken, that do have influence on my world? I'm going to take advantage. I do think it's interesting. This is one digression from DCC, from the Dungeon Crawl Classics method, is this last section where it talks around when you do this, you are both taking from these realms of magnificent infinite power, but you're also giving back. You have to sacrifice something, whether it's material components. What's interesting, the difference here between DCC and Dungeons and Dragons is that in DCC, you are technically giving up your life force, or that's a possibility, the possibility of corruption from the spells. Here in Dungeons and Dragons, here in first edition Dungeons and Dragons, you are using in many ways material components, or your breath, or whatever. What was the other thing? Word, sound, stored energy. Is you were using that to pay the price of tapping into, of plugging in. Is technically, this is the price that you pay to your Pacific Gas and Electric, is your material components, right? To get electricity to your home. Sorry, that's my California speaking. I don't know where I get power from here in Wisconsin. We Power, is that what it is? But yeah, there's a bill that you have to pay to access these infinite power stores, but it doesn't come out of you. Well, a lot of the modern OSR systems, like, again, I'm going directly to Dungeon Crawl Classics, which does have this corrupting feature. That there's the classic picture in Dungeon Crawl Classics, which everybody loves and talks about, where it shows this is what a first edition wizard, or excuse me, a first level wizard looks like. And he's, he's the bright, happy looking hedge wizard. And then you move, and then you just see him slowly get corrupted. You see like strange boils, festering upon his face. You see his hands turning into claws. And by the 10th level magic user picture, he's like completely hunched over. He has a tail. It's like, it's fantastic. First edition D&D is not doing that. You're saying you pay the price. You're paying your sacrifice to the gods, or to whatever, these powers on the prime energy planes through spell components. And because it would be too dangerous it would be way too dangerous if you used your own life source energy. There's I just there's so much I want to say about this, but I love that he gives a shout out to Jack Vance and John Bellairs. Have you read John Bellairs' Face in the Frostbend?
I've read no John Bellairs and no Jack Vance, but I found a Jack Vance quote from Turgeon of Mere that explains kind of Vancian magic if I could read it into the record, but I
Yeah.
don't want to interrupt you.
No.
Okay, so this is Turgeon of Mere by Jack Vance, and I have found it on theevilgm.wordpress.com from 2012. So, the tomes which held Turgeon's sorcery lay on the long table of black steel, or were thrust helter-skelter into shelves. These were volumes compiled by many wizards of the past, untidy folios collected by the sage, leather-bound librams setting forth the syllables of 100 powerful spells, so cogent that Turgeon's brain could know but four at a time.
Yes. Yes.
Turgeon found a musty portfolio, turned the heavy pages to the spell the sage had shown him, the call to the violet cloud. Sorry, the call to the violent cloud. Much different meaning. He stared down at the characters, and they burned with an urgent power, pressing off the page as if frantic to leave the dark solitude of the book. Turgeon closed the book, forcing the spell back into oblivion. He robed himself with a short cape, tucked a blade into his belt, fitted the amulet holding Lacadel's rune to his wrist. Then he sat down, and from a journal chose the spells he would take with him. What dangers he might meet he could not know, so he selected 3 spells of general application: the excellent Prismatic Spray, Thandel's Mantle of Stealth, and the Spell of the Slow Hour. And again, that's Turgeon of Mere by Jack Vance.
Yeah, one of the things that we haven't talked much about is which is interesting, because we talked a little bit about the mechanics, this concept of sacrificing spells or attrition. But one of the things we didn't talk about is directly in that Jack Vance thing, is one of the advantages of the system is that you is that agency towards the player. This is the play mechanic, is what are you going to prepare for the challenge that awaits you? What is appropriate to what module or a scenario that you're currently playing? And I like that as well. This concept of like, all right, you've got to choose your spells. You've got a limited amount. What do you think is going to be appropriate for this encounter?
So Um, Sadly, I think that we need to leave it there today. Is that right, Scott?
I do, but man, how like you can read. I'm sorry, this is one of my favorite sections, the Advanced Dungeon Master's Guide. How you can read this and not instantly want to play Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and then you reading the Jack Vance thing excerpt and just it absolutely puts me in this mind space so viscerally of like wanting to like it's just so evocative and seductive to being like we are it's so there's I'm sure there's a word for it, but it so much suggests even the concepts like tapping to these other powers. Again, I'm driving, and if anybody out there is um you know is a part of that, I'm probably driving you nuts right now. But there's such a wonderful resonance of forbidden lore and concepts of like strangeness and the uncanny that Dungeons and Dragons suggests in some of these early modes, and of course from its inspirations in Jack Vance, that I just think is so there's no word I have that it is. It just makes me want to play instantly. I just find it so fascinating and fun, and it's to me, it's what's
Hmm.
not revelatory, but what is so brilliant and compelling about these early systems that they
Well, and
occupy this heavy metal system of like, yes, this is crazy stuff. Let's do this.
to me, the thing that jumps out is where this system sits in the history of magic. Because, you know, spoiler alert, I don't think magic is real. And therefore, the Vancian magic system adapted into AD&D is just as valid in the history of magic as the runic magic of the Scandinavians in the Middle Ages. And the way that magic has progressed over time is really interesting to me. We should probably have Daniel Harms on the podcast sometime to talk about this. He is, I think, the most relevant voice to talk about history of magic, or at least everything he writes seems to be about history of magic. Most relevant to the nerd field, he wrote the Encyclopedia Cthulhuiana for Chaosium, which I believe they're reprinting soon. Anyway, um, the it certainly seems to me that this idea of magic as an infinite source of power just off stage that you can access is a very modern interpretation of magic, and that it seems to be that magic is an expression of human possibility in AD&D, whereas a lot of earlier magic was, again, like if you go back to the Middle Ages when magic is clearly demonic and evil and satanic, it is explicitly not a off-screen future human resource, but rather a thing that you should not use and is forbidden. And this recasting of magic in a more humanist light, for lack of a way of putting it, is really interesting to me. But
Hmm.
I am by no means the person most qualified to discuss this. I am not a historian of magic, but I'm going to write down, talk to Daniel Harms and see if he would be able to talk about this with us because I'm fascinated.
Yeah, I think,
Um,
and I think this should be, there's a lot of times we have ongoing threads that we kind of talk to because we're not done with spells, right? We've got like 30 pages here. I think that concept should be a thread that we should continue to explore. This concept of where is, isn't because it's like I see that. I definitely see that. And I think it's interesting that this is definitely a more humanistic agency providing resource for characters in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, where again, Dungeon Crawl Classics makes it very much like you're at the what I can see the concept. Well, I can see that DCC made it more explicit, but I see it more as you're at very much at the whim. Because if you think in terms of how characters are constantly, uh, they do often have masters to serve. Whether it's their alignment, but I'm not sure. I think you make a really really good point because you can bend these powers to your whims without a lot of explicit what's the word, attrition to your character, which you're right, I think does cast it as, in many ways, a humanistic, does provide more agency for the player characters that doesn't necessarily always ride. Clerics, on the other hand, though, of course, are completely connected to, connected to a deity that they have to continually make to continually make sure that they're on the right side of. I wrote something in Discord that I kind of want to end on before we say anything, which is I talk about how these words, these kind of rules kind of resonate with this uncanny level of, tapping into these kind of strange things, into the concepts from these different literature. And I said something that I thought was interesting was I was like, one of the things I like about these worlds is like, you want to play in these worlds, but you wouldn't want to live in them because they are kind of scary and dangerous. Like it's the concept of like, how do we play in this world to keep it a bit at a ludic arm's length? Because these worlds are in the end kind of scary, dangerous, and strange. These forbidden tomes And that's again, I keep mentioning like the bothering about Dungeons and Dragons group. It both works both ways. One, it like repels folks to be like, look, these things really have power. It's telling you literally how magic works. You should not be touching these things. But of course, that's the seductive allure of the 1980s to a teenager who's like, these things really tell me how to cast. They don't really tell you how to cast spells, of course, but they tell you how to kind of pretend to be in a world where you do. And maybe that's also what the allure was easily, in the 1980s or for teenagers who were first playing this game, is it did certainly offer a level of it just connecting to what you just said, it does provide this kind of agency that I imagine folks, in adolescence and puberty weren't necessarily feeling freedom, power, independence that their actual lives were providing very little of.
Yeah, just
Um,
to say one last sentence, the idea that by using a book, you could access limitless planes of power,
yeah, yes.
certainly appealed to the kind of person that would be playing Dungeons and Dragons in the 1980s, because
Yeah.
we were all those book kids. Let me tell you, I played about 3 games of soccer in my life, and I was terrible at it. I've never been good at sports. I break fingers really easily. Like, so the books are where I found my value and meaning. But I was never as good as Becky Nowak, my ancient rival from grade school. Anyway, with that, I am historian Ben Riggs. If you have not yet purchased my book, Slaying the Dragon: A Secret History of Dungeons and Dragons, the hardcover print run is running out. So if you haven't gotten it hardcover yet and you want to go and do a little digging, you can still get it, but it's going. So uh, last chances, everybody. Once it's gone, it's gone. Uh, Maybe there'll be a reprint sometime, but it won't be a first print run. Uh, and we have a delightful Discord where discourse constantly continues on these topics. I shamefully have not checked it this week, but I promise I will. Um, Scott, anything else you want to shout out?
I do want to shout out that this podcast is only made possible by the support of our Patreon subscribers. Please, if this is a podcast you listen for regular time, please sign up to the Patreon. It does allow us to do this, allows us to bring on some of the really fantastic guests that we've had recently. So the Discord, and then, of course, if you want access to that Discord channel, you have to join as a Patreon member. Beyond it, of course, if you get on the Discord channel, you can always read my dissertation, which is just rollicking a good time.
All right, with that, Scott, you have a great Sunday.
You take care, man.
Bye bye.